My name is Judith. I am a 68-year-old widow and I had just won $2,300,000 in the state lottery. My heart was pounding as I hurried upstairs to share the life-changing news with my son and my daughter-in-law. But before my knuckles could even touch the wood of their bedroom door, my son's voice stopped me cold. "We need to talk about Mom," he said, his tone sharp and irritated. "We can't keep doing this. She is a financial burden and I have had enough." The winning ticket trembled in my hand. In that exact fraction of a second, the illusion of my family shattered, and I made a decision. Those words were a betrayal I couldn't unhear. Just 2 years ago, I sold the modest home where my late husband and I had lived for 30 years, handing over every single penny to save my son from bankruptcy. Back then, my daughter-in-law hugged me with tears in her eyes, swearing I was an indispensable part of their family. But reality is cruel. Once their financial storm passed, I was downgraded from a savior to an uncut expense. I didn't kick the door open. I didn't demand gratitude or scream. Instead, I carefully smoothed out the wrinkled lottery ticket, tucked it deep into my cardigan pocket, and turned around. As I walked silently back down the stairs, I wasn't a burden anymore. I was a woman with a plan. If you want to see exactly how a discarded mother uses $2,300,000 to teach her ungrateful family a lesson they will never forget, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon. Trust me, you do not want to miss how this ends. For 3 days following that fateful night, I did not utter a single word about what I had heard, choosing instead to quietly observe everything unfolding around me. The house felt different, or perhaps my eyes were finally open. I used those quiet hours to make discreet phone calls from the garden. I contacted the Oklahoma Lottery Commission and thoroughly researched the legal procedures for claiming a prize through a blind trust. I needed to ensure my wealth remained completely anonymous before my son Jack could find the courage to kick me out. Every evening I watched him avoid my gaze while my daughter-in-law Margaret hummed cheerfully in the kitchen, completely unaware of the plans I was making. The inevitable moment arrived on the morning of the 4th day. We were sitting at the dining table, the clinking of silverware echoing in the stifling silence. Jack finally cleared his throat, his face flushing slightly as he slid a glossy brochure across the wooden surface toward my coffee mug. It was an advertisement for a rundown low-income senior living complex situated on the desolate outskirts of Tulsa. He refused to look me in the eye. "Mom," Jack began, his voice dripping with rehearsed, fabricated concern. "Margaret and I have been talking. This house is getting too cramped and Margaret really needs a proper home office for her work. We think this community would be much better for you. You will be around people your own age and they have staff on standby." He braced himself. I could see the tension in his shoulders, fully expecting me to burst into tears to beg or to remind him of the house I had sold to save him. I did none of those things. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, gently set the mug down on the coaster, and looked directly into his shifting eyes. "All right," I said calmly. "Just 2 words. No anger, no negotiation." Jack's jaw went slack. The speech he had prepared died in his throat. He blinked, utterly stunned by my emotionless surrender, while Margaret paused her chewing, exchanging a confused glance with her husband. I did not wait for them to process their shock. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, I had packed my few remaining possessions. I zipped up the old frayed suitcase that had accompanied me through decades of hardship and walked toward the front door. I did not ask for a ride, I simply called a taxi. As I stood in the hallway, I glanced into the living room. There was no loud celebration, no popping of champagne corks to mark my departure. Instead, Margaret was casually lounging on the beige sofa, a tablet resting on her lap. She was lazily scrolling through Zillow, tapping the screen as she mumbled calculations to herself about tearing down my bedroom walls to finally build her dream kitchen. She did not even look up to say goodbye. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind me. P3. Moving to that rundown apartment was in reality merely a temporary stepping stone, buying me the crucial time I needed to finalize all legal procedures with my attorney Henry. Behind the scenes, my life was transforming rapidly. I purchased a stunning sprawling estate tucked away in the quiet, affluent neighborhood of South Tulsa. The transaction was completely untraceable, securely hidden behind the impenetrable walls of my newly established blind trust. I finally breathed clean air in a sanctuary that belonged entirely to me. The only fragile connection I maintained with my previous life was my 15-year-old granddaughter, Kayla. She would frequently sneak out pedaling her bicycle furiously across town just to escape the suffocating atmosphere her father and stepmother had created. Our bond had always been uniquely profound. When she was just a little girl, Kayla used to drag her heavy blankets into my cramped bedroom, seeking a quiet refuge on my floor whenever Jack and Margaret's vicious screaming matches shook the hallway walls. In that house defined by profound selfishness, she was the absolute only person who ever looked at my exhausted face and gently asked if I was tired. One rainy Tuesday evening, Kayla arrived at my new address completely soaked from the autumn downpour. I handed her a warm towel and stood at the expansive kitchen island quietly peeling some apples. Suddenly my cell phone rang. It was Henry. Assuming my granddaughter was safely distracted by the television in the adjacent living room, I confidently answered the call. "Everything is perfectly set, Judith." Henry's professional voice came through the receiver. "The transfer of the $2,300,000 into the primary holding account is officially complete. The property is yours, free and clear." I thanked him and ended the call only to turn around and find Kayla standing completely frozen in the hallway archway. The towel had slipped off her shoulders. Her wide, astonished eyes darted from the expensive granite countertops to the glowing screen of my phone. She had heard absolutely every single word. There was simply no point in lying to the only human being who genuinely loved me. I gently gestured for her to sit down beside me. Slowly, I explained everything. I told her about the winning lottery ticket, the crushing conversation I had overheard outside her parents' bedroom door, and my ultimate decision to walk away. I braced myself, expecting her to experience defensive anger on behalf of her father. Instead, heavy tears welled up in her eyes. She lunged forward, hugging me fiercely. She deeply felt my accumulated pain and completely understood my strategic silence. Pulling back slightly, she wiped her wet face and held out her hand, deliberately extending her little finger. It was a comforting gesture from her early childhood, a sacred pact we used to make. I smiled through my own unshed tears and wrapped my pinky finger tightly around hers. In the quiet warmth of my magnificent new kitchen, we sealed an unbreakable promise to keep my financial empire an absolute secret. Late that autumn, the first perfect opportunity to test my financial independence presented itself. Henry called me with fascinating news. Jack was being entirely consumed by Margaret's desperate need for social validation. They were emptying their savings accounts and even taking out high-interest short-term loans to participate in a local real estate auction. The property in question was a sprawling, modern luxury home in a highly coveted neighborhood, far beyond their actual means. Margaret wanted it simply to flaunt her imagined status to her superficial circle of friends. The auction took place on a crisp, cloudless afternoon. The venue was a polished conference hall filled with murmuring investors and hopeful couples. I arrived shortly after the bidding began, looking completely different from the tired, worn-out woman who had dragged a frayed suitcase out of their house just months ago. I wore a tailored charcoal gray cashmere coat, subtle pearl earrings, and a quiet confidence that only true financial security can provide. I took a seat near the back, keeping my head slightly lowered behind designer sunglasses. I watched Jack and Margaret near the front row. Margaret was practically bouncing in her seat, clutching Jack's arm tightly, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Jack was sweating heavily, his posture rigid, as he aggressively raised his numbered paddle. The numbers climbed higher and higher, eliminating most of the room, until it was only Jack and one proxy bidder left. Then the proxy finally dropped out. Jack let out a loud, breathless sigh of relief. Margaret squeezed his shoulder, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. The auctioneer raised his wooden gavel high into the air. "Going once, going twice." I smoothly raised my own paddle. I did not scream out a ridiculous doubled figure to create a theatrical scene. I had done the math with Henry beforehand. I calmly called out a number that was exactly 5% above Jack's absolute heavily leveraged maximum limit. It was a precise surgical strike, enough to completely sever their hopes, but just enough to ensure they were entirely suffocated by the financial gap. A heavy silence fell over the large room. Jack frantically whispered to Margaret, his face turning a sickening shade of pale. He vigorously shook his head. They were completely tapped out. The auctioneer brought the gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. Sold to the lady in the back for a full cash transaction. I slowly lowered my sunglasses. Jack spun around in his chair to see who had just shattered his wife's dream. Across the aisle, our eyes met. I saw a sharp, piercing flash of suspicion ignite in my son's pupils. His mouth opened slightly, but the sheer absurd impossibility of his discarded, impoverished mother buying a luxury mansion in pure cash short-circuited his brain. He simply could not process the reality standing right in front of him. I gave him a brief, unreadable nod, turned on my heel, and walked out the door without a single word. Losing that dream house was merely the first spark that ignited the precarious pride of Jack and his wife. The immediate aftermath of the auction sent Jack into a frantic, obsessive spiral of investigation. The local real estate market in Tulsa is surprisingly small, and whispers of a mysterious cash buyer operating through a high-level blind trust circulated quickly among elite brokers. Driven by a maddening suspicion, Jack relentlessly connected those industry rumors, piecing together the impossible reality. The anonymous lottery winner who had publicly humiliated them was his own mother. The truth must have struck him like a physical blow, dismantling his remaining arrogance. Simultaneously, the crushing reality of their disastrous financial decisions violently caved in on them. Margaret's relentless, lavish spending habits had completely maxed out their credit cards on superficial luxury items they could not actually afford. Furthermore, the aggressive high-interest loans they had recklessly secured just to qualify for the auction bidding now demanded immediate, impossible repayments. The suffocating pressure of impending bankruptcy rapidly stripped away Jack's false sense of superiority. Driven to the absolute edge of total ruin, Jack eventually tracked down my new address. Late one chilly afternoon, he appeared outside the imposing iron gates of my South Tulsa estate. I saw his car on the security monitors and walked down the long paved driveway, stopping a few feet short of the heavy metal barrier. I deliberately kept the electronic gates securely closed, separating my peaceful world from his chaos. Jack gripped the cold iron bars tightly, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked visibly exhausted, his tie loosened and his eyes underlined with dark, heavy shadows. He did not bother with fake, tearful apologies or dramatic pleas for forgiveness. He knew I would instantly see right through that transparent facade. Instead, he callously deployed the one specific tactic he firmly believed would break my resolve. He used a child as emotional leverage. "Mom, you cannot just abandon Kayla," Jack said, his voice strained and noticeably desperate. "She needs her father to be financially stable. She needs her home. Please, you have to help this family survive this mess." I stood perfectly still, looking deeply into his frantic, bloodshot eyes. In that tense, heavy space between us, a cruel and undeniable truth completely solidified in my mind. Jack was not apologizing. There was absolutely no genuine remorse in his soul for tossing me into the streets or labeling me a useless financial burden. He was only standing there because his own reckless choices had firmly cornered him. He was not sorry for his past cruelty, he was simply terrified of his impending poverty. Any lingering trace of maternal guilt completely evaporated into the cold air. I realized that giving him even a single dollar would be a severe betrayal of my own dignity. I did not shout. I did not deliver a vindictive lecture to point out his blatant hypocrisy. Words were a valuable currency he no longer deserved from me. Instead, I met his manipulation with absolute, punishing silence. I held his desperate gaze for one long, definitive moment, letting the sheer, crushing weight of my rejection settle over him. Then, without a single utterance, I turned my back and walked slowly toward my brightly lit home. Those spiraling toward the absolute bottom of the abyss often have a dangerous tendency to drag down anyone weaker around them. Completely cut off from my financial resources and left to drown in their own making, Jack and Margaret turned their chaotic desperation inward. The toxic environment inside their home quickly reached a terrifying boiling point. Unable to maintain their superficial lifestyle and hounded continuously by relentless creditors, they violently shifted their heavy burdens onto Kayla. They abruptly forced my 15-year-old granddaughter to pick up exhausting late-night part-time shifts at a local diner immediately after school. They ruthlessly demanded she hand over every single minimum wage paycheck just to cover their mounting utility bills and aggressive credit card penalties. The breaking point arrived late one freezing Wednesday night. My phone screen lit up with a frantic, desperate text message from Kayla, begging for a rescue while a violent screaming match echoed through her bedroom walls. My immediate burning instinct was to grab my car keys, drive over there, kick their front door off its hinges, and physically pull her out of that nightmare. However, Henry calmly but firmly intervened. He advised me that if I wanted permanent, undeniable custody, we absolutely had to play strictly by the cold, unforgiving rules of the family court system. A dramatic emotional outburst on my part would only give Jack ammunition to frame me as unstable and jeopardize everything. Instead of making a loud scene, we spent the next several agonizing weeks quietly building an impenetrable legal fortress. Kayla bravely became our silent inside informant. Whenever the house erupted into chaos, she locked herself in her small bathroom and secretly recorded the vicious, verbally abusive tirades Margaret launched at her over missing grocery money. She covertly took clear date-stamped photographs of the bright red foreclosure warnings and final debt collection notices taped routinely to their front door. Most importantly, she screenshotted the highly manipulative, threatening text messages Jack sent her during his frequent panicked outbursts, explicitly ordering her to work longer hours or face being thrown out onto the street. Every single piece of damning data was securely transmitted to Henry's encrypted legal files. He meticulously organized the chilling audio clips, the undeniable proof of severe financial delinquency, and the documented emotional abuse into a devastating, ironclad portfolio. We were no longer just fighting a petty family dispute or engaging in a bitter shouting match. We were legally proving severe parental negligence, financial exploitation, and child endangerment in front of a judge. Armed with this bulletproof dossier, Henry confidently bypassed any standard drawn-out mediation processes. He officially filed a comprehensive emergency intervention petition with Child Protective Services and the local Tulsa family court judge, formally requesting the immediate removal of a minor from a dangerously toxic household. A court-appointed server delivered the terrifying legal summons directly into Jack's trembling hands, right as another aggressive debt collector was pounding relentlessly on his front porch. The methodical, silent legal trap we had so carefully built alongside Kayla had finally snapped completely shut, leaving them absolutely no room to escape. The family court hearing took place on a bleak gray winter morning, carrying with it the bone-chilling cold of harsh reality. Inside the sterile wood-paneled courtroom, the sheer volume of undeniable evidence we presented was completely overwhelming. Henry methodically laid out every single piece of our meticulously gathered documentation. The judge listened grimly to the terrifying audio recordings of domestic hostility, reviewed the aggressive text messages, and examined the extensive bankruptcy filings. The final ruling was swift and absolute. I was officially granted full permanent legal custody of my granddaughter. Jack sat at the defense table entirely alone, looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had once tried to discard me. Stripped of their perfect suburban facade and with their remaining assets aggressively seized by the bank, Margaret's fragile loyalty had finally reached its absolute limit. Just 2 days prior, the very moment the glaring foreclosure notice was firmly taped to their front door, she had mercilessly dragged her packed suitcases out to the driveway. She did not even bother to look her husband in the eye one last time. She simply tossed a freezing, callous sentence over her shoulder: "I did not marry a loser." Now walking out of the heavy double doors of the municipal building, Jack stood isolated on the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. He was utterly broken, physically slumping under the crushing, suffocating weight of the devastating consequences he had actively chosen. He looked toward me with bloodshot eyes, perhaps desperately hoping for a final sliver of maternal pity or a last-minute financial rescue. But my well of forgiveness had completely dried up. This was the singular defining moment I truly turned my back on him. I did not offer a goodbye. I silently opened the warm passenger door of my luxury sedan for Kayla, securely closed it behind her, walked around to the driver's seat and drove away forever, leaving my son standing alone in the freezing wind. Inside the quiet, heated cabin of the vehicle, the city streets rolled by in a peaceful blur. I glanced over at the passenger seat. Kayla was resting her head against the soft leather, a gentle, undisturbed smile resting on her young face for the very first time in months. Watching her breathe so easily, a profound, unshakable realization settled deep within my chest. I finally understood that a true family is never an automatic right, simply guaranteed by shared bloodlines or biological obligations. It is an active daily choice rooted entirely in mutual respect, protection, and genuine care. Elderly parents are not disposable fuel meant to be endlessly burned to sustain the greedy materialistic illusions of their grown children. Securing my absolute financial independence and having the courage to permanently sever ties with a highly toxic relationship was not an act of cruelty. It was ultimately the only viable way to protect my own dignity and provide a permanent loving sanctuary for the ones who truly deserved it.